Welcome back to .NET Rocks. This is Carl Franklin.
And this is Richard Campbell.
And, man, we're still here in the fishbowl.
I like it here.
NDC, Norway, Oslo. Fun. But you know all about that. So
We've been there.
Let's
We've done
just cut the chit-chat and get right to business, shall we?
Okay, what's the business of the du jour?
It's a little thing we call Better Know Framework.
Awesome. All right, dude, what do you got?
Well, it's a very interesting post on Stack Overflow. The title is, I am creating an email spammer for an outstanding cause. Listen to this. In Cuba, web access is extremely censored, so I created a tool that allows more than 50,000 people to browse the internet through email. Let me say that again. Browse the internet through email.
Oh my goodness.
Cubans send me an email with a URL in the subject line, and I email them back with the response.
Which is the web page.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. It was working like a charm till the communist government of Cuba started blocking my emails. Because that's what they do. My solution was rotation. I started with Amazon SES, and I was changing the domain each time it was blocked. But Amazon adds a header to all emails, and once they blocked the header, no email from SES was able to reach Cuba anymore. The same happened with Mailgun and others. They all add headers. Currently, I'm creating Gmail accounts and sending via SMTP, but Google blocks me for no reason and only allows to send 100 emails a day per account. Also, I can only create a few emails using the same IP or phone, right, IP address. So I was forced to use anonymous proxies and fake Chinese phones. Now I'm fighting a war on two fronts. An email can be blocked by 3 parameters: IP address, domain, and email address. It will be terrific if I can set up my own postfix server at a VPS that auto-rotates the IP addresses. Even better if I can simulate gmail.com to avoid purchasing a new domain every day. This is pure evil. I love it.
For a good cause.
For a good cause. All the intents to create what I call the ultimate sender just either reach the spam folder or add unwanted headers, making it too easy to block. I feel exhausted. I hit a knowledge barrier here. I know I'm crossing to the dark side, but this is for a very good cause. Thousands count on this service as their only source of unbiased news, social network, and to feel part of the 21st century. Can you please help me creating the ultimate sender, blah, 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 blah. I just thought that was a really
There's a couple of really good answers here too,
interesting
right? Like
problem.
a Tor-based email server, that's the solution.
Yeah.
You know, something that is fundamentally anonymized and it creates basically a one-way email channel, but that's fine. They're only blocking the inbound, so there is a solution.
Tor
to
is
that.
called the onion router.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's really where they want to go.
So all you had to do is ask Richard Campbell. He's got a hacking solution.
I only read.
Actually, you were only.
I read the
yeah.
answer and went, "Yes, that's what I would do if I had to do it." I would not really think of it quite that fast.
No, sure. But isn't it interesting that all of a sudden you're on the other side of security when you're trying to.
There's a whole ethical discussion on this as well,
right.
Terms of should be subverting, like what is your responsibility here? I think it's very interesting.
It is,
and I don't know that we want to go there today.
No, absolutely not. It's just something neat to think about on your commute to work.
Yeah,
right.
Spamming for a legitimate cause.
Yeah, exactly. That's what
which is subverting a government.
Yeah.
Let's contemplate how legitimate that actually is.
Yeah. So who's talking to us, Richard?
Grabbed a comment off of show 1268, the one we did with Jeremy Miller, talking about Martin on Postgres.
Yeah.
And that was the blob store, essentially, the smart blob store that Jeremy was helping to support that runs on Postgres. Lots of good comments on the show. This particular one comes from David Prothero, who said, I'm worried about the claim that eventual consistency is a, quote, bad thing, and therefore Martin and Postgres are superior to RavenDB. I don't doubt at all that it is a superior solution for Jeremy's team and their use cases, but to cast eventual consistency as a universal drawback isn't appropriate. And just to recap a bit here, because this show is from like a year ago, we were talking about, there's been a lot of controversy around RavenDB as a very .NET-centric document database versus Postgres, which is, great open source product, and here's a document store in the form of Martin that can do a similar thing, and they have different approaches to it. And David would go on to say, Carl and Richard clearly understand the benefits of the eventual consistency approach in web scale applications, and we're pushing Jeremy to address these points, but I don't think he adequately addressed them. Because, of course, that's not the focus of what they're doing with Postgres and Martin.
Sure.
Anyway, I'm skeptical that full ACID writes with all of your indexes being updated before the write returns to the user is a good solution for web scale transactional systems. It's also not really necessary, right? And that's what RavenDB, Mongo, and other document stores are designed for. For a modest scale line of business apps, I can definitely appreciate the best of both worlds approach by combining fully ACID SQL with a JSON document database. I think Martin is a great idea, and I will keep on watching this project for sure. Can't wait to see how it fares under more production scenarios. I'm just a little concerned about the tone of the show and how apples will be compared to oranges. And I think that happens. You know, there's multiple solutions to any given problem, and not everybody has, eventual consistency is not a panacea for anything either, right? And anybody working against a serious ACID database like Postgres or SQL Server, it's kind of hard to avoid the truth when it comes to writes. You're always going to run into that, and anytime you subvert that, you're going to have problems because there's so much presumption in the engine about that consistency that breaking it's just you don't know the gremlins you're creating if you try and subvert it. Now, the eventual visibility of that data, having synchronous, writes. Maybe they even sit in a pipeline of some kind of queuing system, so you're delaying the write so that it can be synchronous. You're not going to see it for a while. I'm happier with that than I would be with subverting it. But David makes the point. There are other data stores with other goals if that's what your architectural needs are.
Yeah.
So, David, thank you so much for your comment. A .NET Rocks mug is on its way to you. And if you'd like a .NET Rocks mug, write a comment on the website at .NETRocks.com or via any of our social media, because we publish every show to Facebook and Google+. And if you comment there and we read it on the show, we'll send you a mug.
And definitely follow us on Twitter. He's at Rich Campbell. I'm at Carl Franklin. Send us a tweet. Please wait. Accessing. Nope, I got nothing. Anyway, let's introduce our guest today. Steve Faulkner. He's the Director of Platform Engineering at Bustle, where he is championing all things serverless. And previously, he co-founded the streaming music startup Murfie. That's Murfie. And he's from Philadelphia, but he's here in Oslo today. Hi, Steve.
How's it going?
How's it going with you?
Good. I just got done with my talk. I'm feeling relieved.
Excellent.
Yeah. But are you jazzed? You come out of that going, wow, I did a great job. It worked out?
I hope so.
The Norwegians can be hard to read sometimes, too.
They're a quiet bunch. Like things that have gotten maybe some chuckles at every other conference I've presented at. Not so much here.
It's a little tougher.
So before today, I hadn't heard of GraphQL, and I went to graphql.org to try to figure out what this is. And, after looking it over for 5 or 10 minutes, I still can't figure it out. I get that it's a query language for discovering what your API does, but I'm not sure how I would use it or why I would even need to. So this is just a great open-ended question. What is this thing?
All right, so GraphQL, it's a API query language. It's a typed query language. So you specify things in terms of types and the fields that are available to them and things they can return, as well as relationships between those types. And it gives the ability for clients to then decide how they want to structure their queries and what kind of data they want back from the server. I honestly think it's very reminiscent of things like, kind of WSDL and SOAP. It's not that far off of that. It just happens to be the 2017 version sponsored by Facebook.
Fewer angle brackets.
Yes.
So give me an example of when I would use this. I was working with the Google Drive API today, for example, and the documentation is what it is. I mean, it's very granular, it's atomic, and you don't really see how things work together. And unless you have a sample somewhere on some blog somehow or wiki or something, it's very difficult to actually jump in and figure things out unless you take in the whole API, piece by piece, and then try to figure out how these things work together. Is this going to help me in that situation?
If somebody writes their API in GraphQL, then yeah, it will. So I think that's the beauty of it, is that because of its typed nature, you can execute these what are called introspection queries against the API endpoint, which essentially says, tell me everything that you're capable of doing.
So you can write your API using this language.
Yep.
Now I'm really, really confused. I don't. Wouldn't I write an API in a language like C# or?
So you still write them in, and the runtime can still be whatever you want. GraphQL itself is really just a spec for how the client and server are going to communicate with each other. So GraphQL is the server saying these are the types of things I provide, and then a client as well saying these are the things that I am asking for. And the client can submit types as well. When you're sending data to the server, you can say, I'm submitting this field and it's an integer. And if somewhere in your code you end up submitting something that is not an integer, it will actually get rejected by the server. It will say, hey, you said you were going to send me an integer and you sent me a string instead.
Right.
So, sorry, I didn't even process this query.
And so how would I go about using this? I mean, IntelliSense is the thing that comes to mind, but this must go beyond just simply IntelliSense. It must be like, oh well, this particular server thing, this is how it gets called, and
so it all happens at runtime, really, right? It's a way to kind of statically analyze these queries, but at runtime, right? The beautiful part about GraphQL is really there's this killer app, and that's called GraphQL, so GraphQL. And that is their first-class supported API browser, query builder, query executor, and it does those introspection queries. It actually will, essentially proofread your queries. If you're writing queries in there, you can see little squiggly underlines.
We're getting into details, and I still don't understand the big picture. And I'm sorry for. So why would I need a query, and what would I use it for?
So give
me an example.
This is just essentially a replacement for REST APIs, right? This is Facebook saying, well, generic JSON REST APIs are not a good enough language with which to describe these client-server interactions.
Okay, I can understand that.
And so this is saying we're going to make something that is much more specific and typed in order to really get good language around API contracts.
So good example.
Any JSON API, we use it at Bustle for all of our front-end applications. So the front-end application says, I want the post with this ID. I want all of the users associated with that post. I want the comments associated with that post. I want the image URL of all the users associated with those comments. And so you can make this single structured query that gives you all that back in the exact format you want.
I see. So you're really not dealing with the guts of the HTTP spec and bodies and responses and requests and all that. You're just saying, this is what I want. Give me that.
Yep.
Okay.
So the query language is...
I think that just hit me in the brain.
It clicked for you?
Now it clicked.
It's a single endpoint. So GraphQL is designed, you make a post to a server. And the body of that post is what looks kind of like JSON, but it's the GraphQL query language, right? It's very similar to JSON.
And it's typed.
It's typed.
Unlike
and it
JSON.
turns into objects, and you just basically use them.
You get JSON back, but the idea with the query language is it's typed so that the server can reject or accept a query before it even has to execute it.
Rather than what you normally see when you're dealing with untyped stuff, which is like, I don't know what you mean.
Yeah.
Not that you made, and I hate that when here's 10 parameters, I got type wrong on one of them, and a JSON responder just goes, nope.
Yeah.
And you're like, figure it out.
And you don't know what the problem was. And the error stuff, that's one of the best parts about GraphQL is it will tell you not only what part of your query is wrong, it'll give you like the line and location and everything. It'll say this field.
This value, I expected this and you gave me that.
Exactly.
Okay, that's pretty powerful.
The real power for me is that, REST is a great tool, but it's not specific enough, right? APIs are contracts between the client and the server, and as far as contract languages go, REST is a pretty terrible one, right?
But the alternative was SOAP.
The other end of the spectrum can get pretty bad. So we went
WS star specifications. I'm getting hives, man, right now. I'm suddenly itchy.
You're really just wrapping all this stuff up in objects that are domain objects that we understand, right?
Yes.
That's basically what you're doing.
Yeah, and doing it in a way that just requires both the client and the server to be much more on the same page about what can be passed back and forth.
Perfect.
So trying to strike a balance between the huge amount of ceremony we got to in the late 90s, early aughts, that was the WS star stuff, versus the hippy dippy, send me whatever you want, JSON approach. Send me some stuff. If it goes well, you'll get something back.
Yeah, that's kind of the general idea. There's multiple aspects of this. The types is just one part of it. There's also the aspect of being able to give the client control over navigating through the graph of your data.
Sure.
Right. So the whole API is based around, like I said, being able to say, well, I have a post. I want the comments associated with that post. I want the user associated with all those comments.
So rather than making all these separate calls, I'm basically making effectively manifesting a collective call, which somewhere on the back end may end up being a bunch of separate API calls. Somewhere.
Exactly.
And you make it very easy for the consumer of that API just to get what they want and get in and out without having,
It gives the front-end developers a lot more freedom, but then it gives them a lot more independence as well, right?
You also took the whole lot of mutability problems off my table as the developer on the back end, too.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm getting a transaction. I'm getting everything you need as a single call now without having to build the do everything function. Right? I kind of like that.
Yeah.
It's really nice. It's made development, specifically at Bustle, it's made our development process way better. I mean, humans are poor at communicating, and documentation is hard to write. And so with GraphQL, we don't really have to spend a lot of time on either because the API itself generates its own documentation.
Right. And a tool like GraphQL lets you figure it out.
Exactly.
So you just keep tinkering and playing with different options until you see what you want, and then you know what to take to your code.
Yep. It's beautiful, and it's on the back end. It has a lot of advantages as well. I mean, I'm a back end developer, so I spend most of my time trying to figure out how we do stuff behind the GraphQL layer.
And I think we're going to have to probably talk about that part because what does this look like for you as a back-end developer?
So if you read one of Facebook's READMEs on this, they actually just tell you why they built it, which is I think a great quote. And it says, at the time, this is around 2010, Facebook had a ton of, they use the phrase, sundry key value stores. Sundry key value stores.
Yeah.
Data stuff.
Yeah, it's just a lot of different APIs.
A lot of random things.
A lot of different databases. And they needed a way to just roll all that up into one place instead of having to make all these different calls. And so that's kind of where this project came from internally.
Yeah, and you think about Microsoft Graph, I mean, it's the same idea. They have one API that gets to all of the Windows-centric APIs.
Yeah. Well, you don't even want to know. And you don't want to break things when you are actually taking old code and moving it forward. Like, that's the fear when you start. This is all about aging systems, right? That we have many, many different layers to stuff, and maybe we're going to place them, maybe we don't. Maybe we're on the 4th or 5th version of an API, and nobody knows which one to call, even though we leave all the old ones up just in case.
Right.
You eventually get into this morass of an infinite number of calls, and people really uncertain which one to do.
It's very true, right? I think that's one of the things about GraphQL that's nice too, is you can add types kind of incrementally into the system. So, I have a field that might be the field I'm using today, but I will add a field later that might be the new and better field, and I can deprecate the old field. So there are ways to kind of incrementally move your API forward rather than just having to wholesale version it.
One day the call you used to make doesn't work anymore. You have to make the call that looks like this.
Yeah.
Or you keep the 2 versions up, and then you're running this endless code base that just keeps expanding.
Yeah, exactly, right. And it forces those same requirements on the back-end developer as well. So the types go both ways. If I have a type in GraphQL that I say is non-null, and I return null from the back-end database response, it will yell at me.
It'll yell at you.
It'll say...
So you literally have an intermediary that's validating in both directions.
Yeah.
I kind of like that too, right? It's a whole other class of error rather than waiting for the client to complain. You actually intercept it still effectively on the back end, but at an intermediary layer.
Exactly.
So you just piece these things together. Obviously, you start at the server side, I guess, and then and come up with some sort of meta document that describes the relationships.
Yeah, so GraphQL has a schema definition language. It's pretty simple, and you can use that to essentially just generate these pretty simple back-end APIs. There's server clients in a bunch of different languages. .NET has one. The reference one is in JavaScript. So that's kind of the one Facebook officially supports and works on.
But I see Ruby, I see Scala, I see Python, I see Java, Clojure, my goodness, Go, PHP, there's C#. All right.
There's a bunch of them, and arguably some of them are more advanced than the rest of
Elixir.
reference.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah.
So, map to iQueryable. There you go.
All right.
And you know what? You're just seeing the wonders of open source here.
Yeah,
these are different people's
wonderful
efforts to support this underlying library so that they can work in the language they want to work in.
I think that's one of the good things that Facebook did with this is they released it initially as a spec.
Right.
They said this is a language for talking between the client and the server, and this is the spec for it. And they released their reference implementation later, and that allowed everybody else to kind of be on the same page rather than having to just translate whatever they built.
Right, and not cut. Well, they're going to cut and paste Facebook's code if it's there.
Yeah.
Right, and so if you leave it open so that they can explore for a little while first, you get some variation on all of that, which is compelling.
Yeah.
Stephen, give us 1 second here to pay the bills.
This episode of .NET Rocks is made possible in part by Windows on the Google Cloud Platform.
What? Isn't this a .NET show?
Yeah, .NET runs on the Google Cloud Platform, man.
Everything in .NET?
You bet. All the .NET Core libraries and more, including 200 plus Google.com and cloud services. Hey, John Skeet's behind it. He's a genius.
The John Skeet? The Rescue the Princess John Skeet from Stack Overflow?
Yeah, the one and only. You can deploy your ASP.NET Windows apps to Compute Engine or your ASP.NET Core apps to App Engine or Container Engine, which is Google's hosted Kubernetes environment, and it runs like, well, Google.
But what about Visual Studio integration? Oh, it's there. I'm reading it now. You can use Visual Studio to manage your GCP resources and deploy your existing apps.
Yep, you can get stack driver logging, error reporting, and tracing support for .NET and .NET Core.
Also, there are PowerShell commandlets for GCP, which run on Windows and Linux.
And if you need help, there are a great set of partners to get workloads to GCP, including Capgemini, Nudezic, and Magenic.
So go to gcp.netrocks.com and get your free trial today.
.NET on Google. Who knew?
And you're listening to .NET Rocks. We're here at NDC's talking to Stephen Faulkner about GraphQL. And I got to tell you, off the bat, I was thinking, this is some kind of NoSQL database, but it's more important to that, I think.
It definitely is. It's it's at a higher level. It certainly pairs well with NoSQL databases.
Sure.
That was part of the initial use case, but there are people that are doing some really cool things to turn GraphQL queries actually into SQL queries under the hood.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I could see how you could get really nutty with that.
It's something that I think is still for a lot of people in the proof of concept phase. And I've seen some exciting stuff, but I don't really know if people are doing it in production quite yet.
Well, I don't have a whole lot of problem with this. Like, this is easy when you're talking about trying to consume data, where it's like, I want this customer's information and their credit history and the last 10 orders they sent, like all of these different requests that would normally be separate calls, to be able to bundle that up in a blob of text, essentially, and push it up and know you're going to get it all back.
Yeah.
But going the other way, well, here's a whole bunch of data I want you to store. Figure out where it should go.
So this is one of the, I think, problems with GraphQL. Maybe not a problem, but it's a little bit of a rough patch.
Challenge.
So GraphQL has the ability, they have this affordance called mutations, and it allows you to mutate data back to the server. In my honest opinion, it feels a little bit like it was just kind of slapped on. So a
little too mutant for you? Is
Sort
that
of like
is?
a one-stop shop, fix it all, and ask questions later.
I don't know how this went down at Facebook internally at all. I wasn't involved. But
I don't know what they were thinking. But
it looks like they had this great way of querying data, and somebody was like, well, we have all this stuff and servers and things, and why can't we just write data with that same thing?
Sure.
And people were like, yeah, it'd be easier just to do all that, and so they did. And there's definitely some challenges around how you do that. It's possible. It's not impossible to do it, but Facebook has released some other open source projects that you probably just want to use.
That's a better way to do this.
Right.
Well, one of them being Relay. So Relay is a client that kind of handles the mutations and the state and properly updating the server.
Yeah, because that's a big problem. It's a big challenge. It's a big
it
challenge
handles
to do
caching. It handles like some partial refetching of data, and Relay has its own spec that is separate from the GraphQL spec, and essentially is a document that says, okay, GraphQL allows you to do all these things. You should really use it in this way.
Right.
Especially for mutations, and that's what the Relay spec is about.
Okay.
Well, and I think it's totally acceptable to say that GraphQL is a querying language. It's for fetching data, and you write data a different way.
It's something that we've done at Bustle, and we've had pretty good luck with, but we've mostly moved over to mutations, because even though I ragged on them a little bit, they work, they're fine.
Sure.
You do get some benefits. The type safety is something that is really nice.
Yeah,
that's also available in all the mutations.
How careful do you have to be with naming, considering how little data we're effectively expressing here? Like, as soon as you start talking about making calls across what would effectively be many APIs, if you start having property names that match to multiple APIs, you could get into trouble.
That's one of the things that the types kind of help you with is you
Yeah.
have multiple types can each have their own property names. And
Right.
There can be the same property names amongst those. So, you know,
Namespaces? Is there a namespace idea?
there's a way for the client to actually change the name of something that's getting returned. So it might request the comments associated with a post from the server, but it can rename that at query time to something else, and the server will return it with a different name.
Okay.
So that's part of the query language. So there is some control from the client there to say, well, I know what you're going to give me back, and I actually want to munge it a little bit so I can get
I want to
different-
organize it differently.
That's okay. That's
Yeah.
a good
So kind of
solution.
intentional.
Yeah. So, so what are some of the challenges of working with GraphQL?
It's new,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's been around Facebook for a while, but it's been open source for only a couple of years now. I think there's still a lot of stuff that people are trying to figure out. Mutations are a little bit a part of that.
Right.
What's the best way to do this? Best practices. There's some things that GraphQL will not do for you out of the box that you are going to need. One of them is authorization and authentication.
Right.
That's handled completely
Externally.
right now. There's no built-in affordance for that. At Bustle, we've actually extended the kind of reference implementation to include some aspects of authorization. Obviously, some
Because the
of the,
authentication is easy. Just SSL, typical handshake. Like
yeah,
the
that-
authentication is not the hard part. It's what privileges do I have? What APIs am I allowed to call?
exactly. There, you look at data, and you can imagine I can look at my own email, but I can't look at some other user's
Sure.
email. So I can't statically analyze a query. I have to do a runtime check to see, is the user I'm looking at me or is it somebody
Right.
else?
What context are we in here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is some static analysis you can do, and we've done a little bit of that at Bustle, and that's something that I hope eventually makes it into GraphQL. But at some point, you have to do some runtime checks to say, is this data really something the user's authorized to look at?
Sure.
So what does Bustle do? You mentioned them a couple of times.
So Bustle essentially takes the reference implementation and then wraps every single resolver, which the resolver is a concept on the back end in GraphQL. It says, how do I get this data, right? It's just a function that it returns the data to the GraphQL executor.
Okay.
And we wrap all of the resolvers at the time we boot the server in these authentication functions. So we have a bunch of custom authentication functions that
So
we...
Bustle, you're essentially extending GraphQL.
Yeah, I mean, it looks the same to the end user, but it allows us in our server implementation to actually write these custom authentication functions. They're co-located with how you get the data. So
Okay.
am I authorized to look at this data, and where do I get this data are in the same file, same place.
All right.
Allows you to do it all there.
Fair enough.
As far as I know, other people are doing that. There's been some people that have suggested alternatives or ways to extend GraphQL, the actual spec, in order to support this, but nothing's really gotten a lot of traction there. Facebook kind of, has control over that.
Yeah.
And takes
In the end, they're still the dictator for life. It's just an open source project.
Yes.
Unless you're going to fork it and stay forked.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that stuff's rapidly evolving that I wouldn't really want to do that.
Yeah, sure. No, exactly. And it sounds like you got a fair bit of momentum here. Like there's a lot of people working on this thing now.
There's a ton, and there's even other startups that have kind of come out of the woodwork and are working specifically on GraphQL problems, or there are other products around GraphQL. There's a couple of services that are like Firebase, like backend as a service, but
Sure.
just using GraphQL as the method of talking to the server.
Because it doesn't strike. This strikes me so much as a brownfield technology. It's like you have a problem. You have many generations of APIs. You've got a large set there, and you're just trying to make them more manageable, and not punish yourself for legacy.
Yeah.
So it's like it almost seems like this nothing that a startup would need.
I think as a startup, it's really easy to start doing things that you'll probably regret later.
Sure.
I've been one of those people.
That's never happened to me.
Goodness.
I've definitely been one of those people. It's easy to just dump an entire row from a table and return that to the user.
Hey, select star, dude. Like, here you go.
Yeah, and say, this is our API. Now you have access to it.
Yeah.
GraphQL, I think, does not have that much overhead, but it gets you all this stuff that you're going to want to
Sure.
get later.
And do you think it's easier to start with it rather than try and retrofit it in? Like, is that a huge bar?
No, I don't think so. We did that at Bustle. We retrofitted it
Sure.
in. We essentially made a new GraphQL API, and we started wrapping legacy services in it. So that was one of the concepts around my talk today here at NDC.
Yeah.
I was talking about how GraphQL allowed us to really move onto serverless platforms.
Nice.
We were already headed in that direction, but we had to figure out how to move off some legacy stuff. And we took really 3 approaches to that. There was, obviously building new APIs, which is easy to do. Wrapping legacy APIs, which GraphQL also makes pretty easy.
Right.
You can describe how you want the API to look in GraphQL and just make the appropriate backend calls. And then the third one is actually doing imports of data through GraphQL. So this is something where eventually, even with wrapping legacy services, we ran into times where cruft is cruft, bad data is bad data.
Doesn't matter how pretty a bow you put on it.
Yeah, it's a problem. So we have a few of those cases, and the way we were able to get out of that is we actually imported data into our new systems using GraphQL, and that's where the types come in.
Nice.
Is we're saying, go through all the legacy data, import it all into the new system, and if there's bad data in there, GraphQL will just reject it. And that keeps our new environment nice and pristine and clean. And
without having to clean everything out, too.
Exactly.
Hey, Richard.
Yeah, buddy.
Guess what time it is now?
It must be that happy time again.
You got it. It's time to implement a GraphQL API using email for the Cubans.
Nice. For the Cubans.
For the Cubans. Actually, it's time to give away a D-Experience subscription from Developer Express to one lucky member of the .NET Rocks fan club. But first, become a UI superhero with DevExpress UI controls and libraries and deliver elegant .NET solutions that address customer needs today and leverage your existing knowledge to build next-generation touch-enabled solutions for tomorrow. Whether it's an Office-inspired application or a data-centric analytics dashboard, DevExpress Universal ships with everything you'll need to build your best without limits or compromise. Learn more and download your free 30-day trial at devexpress.com/superhero.
Well, all right, buddy. Who's our winner?
Today's winner, Richard, is Don Carroll.
Congratulations, Don.
Yeah.
Golf clap for you, sir.
Absolutely. Don just won the D-Experience subscription from DevExpress just for being a member of the .NET Rocks fan club. And if you don't know what that is, go to .NETRocks.com, click on the big Get Free Stuff button, answer a few questions, and join the .NET Rocks fan club. We have thousands of members all over the world. In every show, we like to give away stuff from our sponsors. And every December, we give away a $5,000 technology shopping spree to one lucky member of the .NET Rocks fan club. But you have to sign up to win. And we like to ask our guest, Steve, if you had $5,000 to spend on technology right now, what do you think you'd buy?
Right now, it would definitely be some pretty nice camera gear.
Yeah, you can always spend money on good camera gear.
We're here in Norway, and I'm just walking around, and I'm looking at all the scenery. It's really gorgeous, and I don't have a camera with me, and I'm like, wow, I really wish I had one right now.
And the phone's not enough.
Yeah,
you want better than that.
It doesn't quite capture the...
What do you have back home?
I had some Canon gear, but I actually just got rid of it. I've been playing with a friend's Fuji, and I'm getting really into that. And so I sold all my Canon gear in anticipation of buying some Fuji gear at some point.
And now you're sort of between cameras at this point.
Exactly.
Yeah, $5,000 on Fuji gear, you'd pretty much be loaded up.
I think I would do pretty well.
Wow.
Yeah, you don't think of Fuji as the standard SLR stuff either, right? It tends to be Canon, Nikon, but they're all everybody's building.
It surprised me. I was a Canon person for a long time.
Sure. Can't go wrong, right? It's sort of the IBM of cameras.
Exactly. It was all great. And then I didn't even know Fuji was like into SLRs. And then I had a friend that got one, and I started playing with it, and I was like, wow, this is like really crazy nice.
Yeah.
And then I started looking around online. It turns out I missed the boat. Fuji got into SLRs quite a while ago, and they are now very popular and rapidly gaining on Canon and Nikon.
And the price is right? Is that the idea?
The price is, similar, and, it's Fuji. It's a little bit smaller. They don't quite have all of the lenses and all of the stuff you're going to have for Canon and Nikon,
Sure.
but I've been impressed. It's just really easy to take a really good photo.
Well, and they've really focused on just the mirrorless stuff too, right?
Yeah.
Like we keep calling them SLR, and they're not really. There's no mirror flipping back and forth.
Exactly,
the
right,
camera.
yeah.
It's all digital all the way.
It's all mirrorless.
Yeah, as well it should be. Like, it's kind of silly.
Yeah.
You're not looking through a viewfinder. You don't need a mirror. Just stop it.
So, of all the languages that you can use with GraphQL, what are ones that we should stay away from?
Languages you should stay away from.
In other words, which ones aren't implemented completely yet, or have?
That's a good question. I'm hesitant to crap all over some other languages, right? Every time I come to a conference and I make a quirk about some of the language, somebody always comes up to me at the end of my talk.
Well, it isn't about the
Don't call
language.
their baby ugly.
Isn't it more about the GraphQL implementation over that language, not the language itself?
Yeah, that's true, right? It's the language itself. Somebody in the community has to come across and make a implementation.
So you're using C# mostly?
No, we're all Node.
You're all Node.
Yeah,
So
we use the
JavaScript
reference
all the way.
implementation. Yep.
Okay.
Which is the reference implementation.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
But I did find the open source library for GraphQL Net, which is mapping GraphQL to iQueryable. So it's been implemented. It's only 8 contributors, but it's fairly current contributions the past couple of months.
Somebody came up to me after my talk and was telling me about it and says it's really good.
Working happily with it.
Yeah.
Wow,
Because
great.
on the surface, as soon as I hear Facebook, I think this is part of that sort of React community.
Yes.
That it's React.js with Relay and GraphQL. Like they all sing and dance. As long as you are all in the ecosystem, you should be fine.
Yep. It's one of the dangers. It's one of the things that actually concerns me about this. I think developer monoculture can be a thing, and it can lead to bad places.
Sure.
Well, it's just foolishly limiting. Then one tip over, one bad thing happens. Maybe we discover a major vulnerability in the V8 engine, and suddenly JavaScript's a problem.
Yeah.
And the whole world comes unglued for you.
Yeah.
And I don't. Not that I think that's likely. But I'm just saying, like, the more we can keep that culture diverse and these pieces used in different ways, we might learn new things about them, too.
Well, and then there's good sides to having monocultures, even though, there are downsides as well. It's a double-edged sword.
It definitely is. Well, I think one of the reasons React and GraphQL both have become so big is because of Facebook, and they're pushing it very hard. They have people working full-time on it, writing open source.
And in a lot of ways, no different than what's happening with .NET Core. And, Microsoft's got all these developers that work full-time on what happens to be an open source project.
Yeah.
And that other people can contribute to. But for the most part, you're going to see Microsoft people doing the contributions. Is that pretty much what you see at least the core level of GraphQL? It's mostly Facebook folks.
Yes, I would say that's true. So I've seen some other people make contributions, but it's mostly Facebook people.
And part of the challenge there is when you have an organization moving that quickly, that focused, is there anything you can contribute? Like they have a roadmap, and where do you go?
So that's a little bit of where the community currently is slightly at odds with Facebook. Is my understanding is that Facebook has much of the stuff the community wants available already internally,
Right.
And then it's just not at the point where they're comfortable open sourcing it yet.
Wow, interesting.
So something I talked about, I think, briefly was query complexity, right?
Yep.
So you can make these really complex queries with GraphQL. My understanding is Facebook has methods of dealing with that internally, but we just don't know what they are yet.
Interesting. Like they see it as a competitive asset of theirs, so they don't want to share with the open source community?
Maybe. I think it's just different teams, different people working on different stuff.
Is it like a Fluent interface? This dot that dot this dot that, or how is it more like LINQ, where you have keywords? What does the language look like?
For GraphQL?
Yeah.
It kind of looks like JSON. So writing the actual schema is both. There's ways to do it in the native language of the runtime. So I'm sure .NET has its own way of doing it. JavaScript has its own way of doing it. But usually these implementations also are capable of taking the language agnostic schema. I can't remember what they call it exactly, but like GraphQL language, and translating that into the native calls, like the native constructors and classes.
Yeah,
and
mapping queryable, that kind of thing.
So, but on the client side, do you use a Fluent?
The client-side language is similar to JSON as well. It's based on brackets, and you actually just specify these like nested JSON structures, essentially.
All right.
Right? They're essentially JSON without any values, right? It's just keys. It's a bunch of keys that you're specifying in something that looks like JSON.
Sure.
And then, but it will bring back sets of data if you want it to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's very interesting.
Cool. Yeah.
The atomic sort of structures. That's to me very compelling. I'm thinking. I know this is about querying, but at the same time, I really think about the show we did a while ago with Vishwas talking about the API management side of things.
Right.
Like that this, while it may not be the focus that Facebook has on it, but just the same way you've been pressing against identity, suddenly to be pressed against some kind of account token so that you could charge, or you could limit number of queries per account, like the kinds of things that cripple an API when you expose it to the wild and you're not Facebook. You don't have an infinite supply of resources. You only want to limit so many calls, or you don't want a badly behaved app to knock down everybody trying to call your API.
Yeah.
It's definitely a concern, especially with GraphQL giving a lot of freedom to the client about how it gets what it wants from the server. There are people who have demonstrated, it's possible to write these really complex queries that could really bring down your server.
Basically DDoS the machine with an expression.
Yeah,
right?
This is another thing that Facebook, my understanding, is they have some internal ways of dealing with us that they haven't open sourced yet. And there's nothing in the reference implementation or in the GraphQL spec that deals with this at all.
Interesting.
So it's kind of up to the backend developer to actually figure this out. So in Bustle's case, what we actually do is we, in the course of a request, just have a counter that's keeping track of how many times we've talked to Redis, how many round trips we've done,
right,
and how many commands we've executed in those round trips. And at some point, it gets to a number, and then it returns to the user and says, sorry, your query got too complex, we stopped it.
Right. So a kind of query governor.
Yeah.
But you do start the process. You're not previewing the entire statement and saying, well, how complex is it going to be? You're going to try it up to a certain point and go, enough.
We don't do that at Bustle, but I know other people that do that, where they try to statically analyze the query for a certain, to get the complexity.
Get a sense of cost.
Yeah. It's difficult to do entirely because sometimes we have list of objects and you're requesting nested structures in there. You don't know how many things are going to be returned.
Sure.
Yeah.
And especially when you start nesting deeply.
Yeah.
It can get pretty gruesome.
Exactly. And you kind of don't know what the multipliers look like there.
Right.
You don't know how many.
Well, next thing you know, you're reinventing the RDMS with its index hinting and so forth. It's like, well, there's not many of that, and you can start doing the math around it. Like, holy cow, how did I end up here?
I think the best solution will end up being doing both. There's going to be some static analysis that happens to say this query is too complex, or you nested it in a weird way that we know is going to be bad.
Yeah.
And then also doing runtime checking and saying, okay, we tried your query.
Yeah.
We got halfway through, and
It's like,
not going to
now
stop.
we've decided you're evil, and that's the end of that.
Yep.
But again, you could play the game of, I have a premium account, so you will be able to do that deeper, heavier, costly query because you're paying for it.
Yeah.
So, but again, I don't know that Facebook's motivated by any of that, but I could see plenty of other people caring about that.
I think it's reflected in the fact that it seems Facebook invented this for some very specific reasons, specifically around making their clients easier to write, making the documentation kind of more
managing the
discoverable.
legacy stores.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so now it's solved a bunch of those problems very quickly and very well for us, but then you have these additional problems that it's brought on board, and you have to figure out how to deal with those.
Well, and what a community ultimately wants. Like, where is the point? This whole conversation with book authors, like once the book is published, it's kind of owned by the readers now. It's their interpretation and their utilization.
Right.
And then you've put this out in open source. We're using it in ways you haven't thought of. It's also ours. We're part of this as well and can take it in different directions.
Yeah. It's something that hasn't been much of an issue yet, but it could potentially become an issue in the future.
Well, and we're coming from a Microsoft world where we're used to the old diagram where it's like circles with guns pointed at each other, and Microsoft's worked really hard to go away from that. But Stephen, you've said a couple of things along the way here about different teams inside of Facebook that make me hint like there's a struggle inside of Facebook around stuff like this, that somebody's developed a cool piece of that, but it's not part of the open source version. Like that to me is very interesting. It speaks to the humanity of Facebook too.
Yeah. I don't have anything concrete. It's mostly through, whispers in the community.
Innuendo, yeah.
But you just hear about, we really want this out of GraphQL, and, somebody will be like, oh, well, that exists, but it's just not open source.
Right.
And, you'll hear about stuff like that.
Having dealt closely with Microsoft and those kinds of issues, there's certain catchphrases we're aware of.
Yeah.
When you say something to a Microsoft team that they've already thought about, disagreed on, and they're looking for feedback to reinforce one way or the other, when you say the right thing, they go, that's good feedback.
Yeah.
That's a secret for, I've already said that, they disagreed with me, now you've supported me, so thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I suspect you're seeing that kind of thing inside of a company as large as Facebook, where there are different teams with differing opinions.
I think that's definitely true.
Pushing around on that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So a very interesting situation to get to, and in some ways kind of relieving to know that, big companies, they all have big company problems.
Are there any gotchas getting started, or is it pretty straight ahead?
Getting started is pretty easy.
Yeah.
There's not a lot going on there. Setting up a simple server, responding with some types, making some queries is great.
Probably demos like a dream. No problem at all.
Well, that's part of it. I think that's why it's been picking up adoption so rapidly. Graphical is awesome.
Yep.
Yeah.
You can have something stood up and say like, look, this works really well, and our friend developers are using it, and like it's really easy to get
Everybody's
that
happy.
first little
Yeah,
bit.
right.
We're singing Kumbaya.
So what I hear you maybe are going to say next is it's when it gets complex where the what hits the fan.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. When you first start getting into some of these production issues, query complexity I talked about as an issue, authorization's an issue, figuring out how to do efficient things with GraphQL sometimes can be an issue.
Okay.
So GraphQL, it's up to the language specific implementation how it resolves these queries, right? So the spec is just about the language of how do I make and receive these queries. In the JavaScript one, it resolves them with promises and in a parallel. So you might request the author's name and their ID and their email and their image profile URL.
Sure.
And the naive thing that will happen is you will make 4 different database requests.
Right.
So there are some other projects, also by Facebook, one being Data Loader. There's a .NET implementation of Data Loader that help you kind of automatically batch some of these queries or try to do some things intelligently.
Okay.
I think that's usually the first gotcha people run into is they start doing GraphQL and they realize they're making a lot of database queries unnecessarily.
Right, and a lot of excess round trips and
Yep.
a lot of waiting around.
So
Because that's what they're used to, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
That's the way we're used to writing APIs.
And then I guess if you're coming from a bunch of different REST APIs, you're probably not any more or less efficient than you were before. But with GraphQL, I think you can do some very efficient things. I'm a little bit surprised Data Loader is not just part of GraphQL because it really is something I think anybody using GraphQL should be using Data Loader. I really don't see a reason why you wouldn't want to be using it.
Okay.
Yeah, very interesting. And then immediately I go, let's go look at the contributors to Data Loader versus the contributors to GraphQL and say, are these different teams? Like, same sort of thing. It's like, what's the separation between them or how are they related to each other?
Data Loader is an interesting project. GraphQL under the hood is complicated and there's a lot of code there.
Sure.
Data Loader is only about 300 lines of code, and if you're somewhat familiar with Node, it's really not hard to understand.
Very straightforward.
It essentially just schedules all of you give it a bunch of promises and it schedules them all to resolve on the next event loop.
Right.
Okay.
And so by doing that, it can then batch them all up into one request.
Nice.
They make one round trip.
Yeah, it's not a complicated thing. I think it's a very clever thing.
Yeah,
So.
it's really interesting. And you'd see how a .NET incarnation of that would end up with callbacks or
async await.
an async await responses.
task.
There are solutions one way or the other. And again, it's like you can do the naive thing and have each one separate, or you could just be a little more patient, package it up and make one trip.
Exactly.
Yeah, very, very compelling sort of stuff. Exciting times for you guys. It sounds very cool. And obviously, you've come at this purely from the JavaScript perspective.
Yeah.
I wonder, this also strikes me as something that would allow us to absorb other platforms on the back end in an easy way. Abstract typing, if you had, say, an old set of Java-based services, like I could wrap this up in GraphQL and just simplify things for folks.
Yeah.
Yep, that's something we've done a lot with at Facebook. Our original APIs were all in Rails. We have a couple other just pure Ruby APIs. So we're able to wrap those in GraphQL, and then we had some different strategies. We did like dual writes. We did some copy on write stuff.
Sure.
Where we're actually moving data out of those old systems.
Right, start building new versions in new platforms, and they don't have to tell anybody. It's called as GraphQL in the end.
So are you
Exactly.
talking about taking somebody's existing API that's not yours and making a sort of a proxy for it? Is that what you're talking about? Because that's a pretty interesting idea.
No, this has mostly been internally that we've just been using our own legacy APIs.
Right.
We haven't really done it with third-party stuff. That said, Bustle actually did just acquire a company a few months ago, and we've had the need to get all of their content into our platform. The way we're going about that, though, is through I talked about import mutations. So
Right.
we've actually written these special mutations that their team is using to import data into our system rather than trying to proxy their API or do something like that.
I just like that seamless migration aspect, that you can shift stuff around, and to the outside world, it makes no difference.
Definitely.
So-
And we've done that internally. We've switched databases behind GraphQL
Nice.
for some parts of it pretty seamlessly.
I love everything about
So I'm
that.
thinking about my example earlier, which was I was working with the Google Drive API and not finding a lot of good examples, having to go to blog posts and things like that. If you could take, so it's obviously doesn't seem like Google is going to implement GraphQL in their libraries anytime soon. So Could you do that? Could you actually set up your own service and your own REST service and wrap all their stuff, as long as you kept the proper state and then created a GraphQL for your own client?
You definitely could. I've seen that, not for Google, but I have seen that for other things where people have tried to take existing APIs and wrap them up appropriately.
And it's not their API.
Yeah, it's not
somebody
their
else's.
API. Just saying this is a better way of doing it. I actually did that myself one time just as like a toy. The Philadelphia Museum of Art, where I live in Philly, has an API that is just a very generic JSON REST API. And I was sort of annoyed that I couldn't query it the way I wanted it to. and it was a little bit difficult.
So I rewired it.
I did. They had a hackathon, and I didn't really participate in the hackathon part, but I did the first day. I sent an email to all the teams, and I said, hey, I essentially put a GraphQL wrapper around the PMA API just so it's easier to work with and easier to explore and stuff like that. I actually have no idea if anybody used it.
That's pretty cool.
But it was...
But an interesting thing for when you did want to experiment with a new API or something, if you put this wrapper on it, because the exploration is so easy and testing so easy and your span of dev languages just got larger, like it seems like a really good practice, actually.
Yeah.
Very compelling.
Yeah, pretty cool. So what's on your radar? What's next for you, man?
Next for me, well, I'm here in Norway. I'm going to the coast for a couple days.
Nice.
To go just explore that.
First time at NDC?
Yeah, first time at NDC.
Glad
first
you
time
made it
in
here.
Norway.
So you're going to fly out to Bergen then?
Yeah. So I'm taking the train out to Bergen.
It's a long ride, actually. You'll enjoy it. It's beautiful.
That's what I've heard. And
Yeah.
I just wanted to get on a train and hang out for a few
Kind
hours.
of go for a fjord tour out there?
Yeah.
Do a little fjord hopping.
Yeah.
And then I'm flying to Amsterdam for a day.
Nice.
Got a friend there. And then going home and just continuing to, I don't know, write more code.
Yep. Get back to work.
Awesome. Steve, thanks very much for talking to us today.
Of course, it was great.
And I apologize for my slow start there, but I hope I was helpful for those that were listening.
This is great. You guys did a good job of like asking the right questions, so I feel like I could cover all the bits.
And now I feel like I could use this stuff and actually do something good with it. So thanks.
Cool.
All right. We'll see you next time on .NET Rocks. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Pwop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and of course in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time.
Got a transmitter banned by the FCC. Yes, I'm a type of